Okay, we're going to jump into the some basics about the land and the people, and then into the history. So Israel, as I mentioned earlier, is a relatively small region. It's a relatively small area. They're very similar. The people of Israel culturally definitely fit into the Middle East and a wider culture. It's often called the Semitic culture. Semitic is a word that comes from Shem, the son of Noah. The Shemites become eventually the Semites, and you still hear that word today in stuff like anti-Semitic, which is discrimination against the Jewish people because they are Jewish. So, in the region, they have things like figs and dates and olives. Those are some major crops. They grow a number of vegetables, although some major ones like pumpkins and squash are native to the United States and our region. So they don't have all of those, but they have a lot of other legumes, different kinds of beans. They have cereal grains, so wheat and oats and barley are all from this kind of area. Some of those are the oldest crops that we have. They were some of the first things that were domesticated for human use and grown by humans. And they use things like beer and wine as a way of preserving the goodness of water and preserving grain for the future. One of the inventions that we have in our lives today, which is very, very important and very, very helpful for us, is refrigerators. They don't have them, and as a result, it's much harder to preserve things over the long term. You have to have ways of doing it in the midst of heat and humidity. And they also don't have as much access to clean water as we do now. They did have a sense of what was clean and what was dirty, so they tried to do their best, but very often they struggled, if not outright failed, because they didn't have the same capability of cleaning their water. So things like beer and wine and ways of preserving water become very important. Even children would often drink them. They used relatively weak brews for children, but even that little bit of alcohol content was able to help prevent some of the diseases. Just culturally, at this time in the world, in ancient civilizations, there's very few wealthy people. For the most part, people are attached to the land. They grow their own food. Most of their energy and most of their time is involved in food production. It's not until much, much later in history that you start to have that change. And that allows culture to develop more, means that the life of the people of Israel is very much tied to agriculture and the seasons, kind of like it is in our area in North Dakota, at least for much of the state. There are 12 tribes, but they're organized into two relatively distinct groups. There's 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south. Traditionally, the 2 in the south are Judah and Levi. If you read the scriptures closely, you'll discover that the tribe of Simeon basically disappears. They're not really talked about again. I wonder if 10 and 2 becomes a kind of colloquially referring to the people of Israel. This is part of the difficulty in English because we call the whole country Israel, but in the Bible also the northern section becomes Israel, its capital is Samaria. The southern section, its capital is Jerusalem. We call Judea, they're the people of Judah, but it also includes those Levites, for the most part, that stay faithful. The 10 tribes are in the north, and that's a little bit further north. Ancient Israel is a culture of the word, and this is something that we haven't had a lot of time to stop and appreciate, and so I think it's hard to get a sense of this. But they have this strong sense that God spoke, and God's words that he spoke were written down. And so what that means is dedication to education, to writing, to working with this living Word of God and language is not just a good thing from a cultural perspective for the development of culture, but is an important part of religion. That faithfulness to God means being able to read His Word. And so what this means is they're one of the first and one of the only ancient cultures to place a higher value on education. They start to work at educating more people in their society and more of their children so that they can read and write, because reading and writing were tied to the scriptures, to the words that God himself used. Now, certainly it's not literacy to the extent that we have it in the modern world, or even that we would have in the world of Europe after the Renaissance. But it's definitely a start. And it's quite surprising. We've been able to do some modern analysis on different things that have been found, and in some cases, out of groups of 100 people staying in one place, there's some evidence that sometimes 20 or 30 of them were able to write, which in the ancient world is almost unheard of. So that's something that's special about the Jewish culture, and I think it's something that we see the grace of God and his providence at work, because he not only chose his people, but because of his relationship with them over time, and because he spoke, they begin to develop an education system. It was important too because they do have a lot of different laws and rules that govern their lives. They have a number of laws that are called the ritual laws or the purity laws. What makes someone clean and unclean, the actions. Very often it's contact with blood that makes people unclean, because blood was thought of as the exclusive domain of God. So certainly there are times where people had to be involved in it. Kids still scrape their knees or their hands on the rocks and the stuff when they were outside or playing around. That's still a part of life. But many of the ritual rules that govern cleanliness and uncleanliness are about that. Some of them are standards of morality. Some of them are things that are moral and immoral. The entire system starts to be thought of that way, even though there's not necessarily a moral component to it other than faithfulness to God or not. There's not something inherently about mixing different kinds of food together, for instance, that impinges directly on morality, but it impinges on cleanliness. Whether you're clean or unclean, whether you are able to formally take part in that assembly and in the religious worship, like offering sacrifices, or not. They also mark a kind of hard boundary line between the people of Israel and the pagan people that surround them. The people of Israel are set apart by these things. It's one of the reasons that they struggle with certain of the ancient cultures like the Egyptians and later in the time of the Greeks and the Romans, because they don't have the same sensibility and adaptability to the way that other people live. Throughout much of Israelite history, there's a problem of synchronism. This is one of the things that happens in the first major section of the Bible until after the Jewish exile in Babylon, although it still comes up after that as well. So synchronism is the mixing of religious systems. It's taking some things that God has revealed, some things that are in the Bible, but very often keeping other gods on the side, keeping these other gods to be part of their life. And so they might pray and offer sacrifices to God on the Sabbath, and pray to God on the Sabbath, and offer sacrifices or do some other things to other gods during the week. Now the Lord himself in the scriptures consider this idolatry. You're worshiping false gods. That is explicitly outlawed in the Bible and is very well frowned upon. But it's definitely there. Pagan society was much more open and adaptable. When you have lots of gods all the time, to just add a few more, build some new temples, that's not so hard. Each town had its own particular gods, each place had a devotion to one god or another. Some of them are really bad news, some of them aren't so bad, but they are all not true gods. They're all caught up in other ways of life. And it's important to remember that pagan ritual is heavily sexualized. So very often gods were worshipped in physical ways. You would sleep with temple prostitutes. That was one of the ways of worshiping the gods. They also had things like they would offer foods and vegetables and fruits and different things in sacrifice to the gods. They would lay them out until the animals devoured them or something happened to them, they decayed, and then they'd move them. Sometimes it goes so far as human sacrifice, like I mentioned before. That is extremely frowned upon in the scriptures and widely outlawed, not very well allowed. So that remains a problem with the people of Israel for quite a while. They have that struggle with worshiping many gods, and like, who is truly God? Is it the Lord in heaven, or is it these other pagan gods? And the basic response is, if the Lord is God, the God of the scriptures is God, then worship him, and then follow what he asks. They struggle with it too. Now we're going to jump into a bit of an overview of Jewish history. So Abraham, and that time that we explained at more depth a little bit earlier, he probably lived around 2000 BC. It's just an estimate. There's reasons why it could be later or earlier, but we're just going to give some numbers to go by that are sort of a helpful device to remember. Moses probably lived around 1450 BC. David and the kingdom takes place in the year 1000. I think he starts to rule in Jerusalem in 970. So it's right around 1000, but it's easy to remember that date because it's a nice round number. So from 1450 to 1000 would be the time of the Exodus, where they leave Egypt, they have the covenant, they invade the land of Israel, and the time of the judges, ultimately coming to a conclusion in the life of Samuel the prophet, and then Saul, the first king. David is the second king that is anointed by Samuel the prophet, and then Solomon will be his son. The first temple was constructed around 957, so close to that time. These dates we have a better sense of. So the two most important ones in the history of ancient Israel are the northern tribes are lost. The Assyrians, they're from the northern part of Iraq. Their capital is Nineveh. They show up, they conquer the northern region of Israel. So the Samaritans, the people, and they take them into exile, and they take people groups and they resettle them into Israel. And this is where you have that problem of synchronism. So a lot of the people that stay in that northern section of Israel have a blending between biblical faith, biblical Judaism, and the pagan customs of the places where they came from. And so by the time of Jesus, there's this antagonism between the Judeans and the worshipers of God and the Samaritans, because the Samaritans have this mixing of other religions in with them. So that happens in 722. The 10 northern tribes are lost. The southern tribes continue on a bit longer. There is a king in Jerusalem, but ultimately they are growing distant from the Lord as well. They start saying that we have the temple, and so God is going to save us, God is going to protect us. In 586, the Babylonians come and destroy the temple and destroy Jerusalem and take a number of the people into exile. Many of the wealthy, many of the leadership, the nobility. The ordinary people weren't as quite as devastated by it. They were able to stay in the land, but there's definitely damage. And a lot of them probably died because when armies came through, they would very frequently destroy food production for the people of the land so that they couldn't supply their own army, and that would eventually lead to famines. So in 586, the southern group of Jews is taken into exile in Babylon. This is the end of the rule of Jewish kings in the land of Israel, 586. There's prophets during this time, there's people calling the people to faithfulness with God, there's struggles, there's antagonism. That is much of the story of the Old Testament. This destruction of the temple, the loss of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem provides a major shock to the Jewish system and the Jewish mentality. They have to rethink the covenant. Has God been faithful to his promises? Did he not abandon us? This looks a lot like abandonment, Lord. It really reveals their pride. They thought of themselves as possessing the temple, as being holy and righteous because they had the temple. Christianity will look back at this and say, no, holiness and righteousness are important, but it's not because you have the temple. It's something that has to take place in your heart. Holiness and righteousness has to come from inside of you, from who you are. The people had struggled with idolatry. They had gone back and forth. The time of the exile is really a time of purification and reset. If you're looking for scriptural books, this is Jeremiah, Ezekiel, parts of Isaiah. The later part of Isaiah speaks to the time of the exile. Was written earlier, but it speaks to this time that happens. Eventually, the Babylonians get conquered by a group from Persia, modern-day Iran. The ancient name of them is the Persians. So they conquer the Babylonians, and their leader is named Cyrus. He becomes Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus is sort of one of these enlightened rulers of the ancient world. Lots of the other leaders were relatively grouchy. They have the army slaughtered. They would hang their bodies on the walls of their cities and those kind of things. They would destroy people and want them to worship their own gods. That was part of civic religion. Cyrus does it a little bit differently. He's like, well, we're not really sure whose God is the most important, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have everyone pray for me to all of their gods. And so that someone will be the right one and some God will protect me. What ends up happening is that this also applies to the people of Israel. And so he starts sending waves of exiles back to the land to rebuild the temple. They rebuild the city walls of Jerusalem. It's the restart of the sacrificial system. And they bring some of the changes with them that they had in Babylon. One of them that we'll talk about a little bit later are synagogues. They had to work at how do you love God, how do you worship him if you no longer have a temple that's the center of your worship. Because in the time of the kingdom, from the time of David onwards, even probably from the time of Saul onwards, ancient Israelite religion is heavily connected to the temple. When the Babylonians destroy it, they have to work through their entire thought about life and about how this works. And it ultimately leads to the development of synagogues, where they would have copies of the scriptures. They needed copies of the scriptures in Babylon. That was something that the people brought with them. And so they formed these houses of worship. They formed these gatherings where they get together and pray. And synagogues are a piece of Judaism that's still around today. There's something that's very familiar from the life of Jesus. Synagogues are often led by rabbis. This national shock that happens and the destruction of the temple is part of what leads to the development of different religious groups, in particular the Pharisees. The Pharisees are a holiness movement, and we'll talk about them in a little bit as well, but their idea was the nation has fallen, we had to go into exile because the people of Israel weren't faithful to God and his commandments. So faithfulness to God and his commandments is literally a question of life or death and the survival of the nation. That can help you get a sense of why they can be harsh and judgmental sounding toward people when their rules are violated or the tradition of the elders is violated. That was a response to this tragedy of national exile. This is a tragedy that we haven't had to face in our world today. It'd be somewhat like September 11th, but September 11th, if the terrorists had succeeded and our nation was basically destroyed and had to restart. And while many things changed in our nation, it was still fundamentally the same. It wasn't under threat in the same way. So this leads to a big change. The people come back, they start in 539, they rebuild the temple, they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. This is the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. You can find those books in the Old Testament. And there's a kind of uneasy truce with the Persians. The people restart the sacrificial system. The Persians don't mind so much. They have these decrees from Cyrus They give them royal permission to do it. And so there's a sort of uneasy peace that lasts for around 100 years. A little bit more, a little bit less. In 323, Alexander the Great, he's a Macedonian. If you remember the timeline of the development of ancient Greece, that kind of starts around 1000 BC, reaches its height culturally in the 400s, but reaches the height of its military power and prowess under Alexander the Great in the 300s BC. And so he conquers much of the known world. They spread like wildfire out of Macedonia through modern-day Turkey. They go down and conquer Egypt, and then they come back and they head out into the Fertile Crescent and even further east toward Persia and modern-day India. Alexander the Great doesn't last for all that long. He dies on his way back from this giant campaign, and his empire is eventually divided into 4 parts. The 2 that are important for our purposes are the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. So, at first, the Egyptian group is stronger, the Ptolemies, and they rule the land of Israel. They're relatively tolerant. They start introducing Greek ideas, but Judaism seems to kind of just drift along as it is, or as it was, in the post-exile. Along come the Seleucids, and the Seleucids are from Syria, and they start to be much stricter about enforcing Greek ideas and morality. They build gymnasiums, they build amphitheaters, they really reject this Jewish separation and Jewish cultural distinction in the way that they dress, in what they eat, and their rulers start to enforce a much, much greater degree of Hellenization, of being Greekified, if you will. This reaches a height under a man named Antiochus IV. He's a bit of a, I want to call him a lot of not very nice words, but I probably shouldn't. He thought of himself as the son of Zeus, and so he considered himself to be a son of God, and he was a bad dude. So he pushes significantly harder. He criminalizes the Jewish religion. He orders the destruction of the scriptures. If Torah scrolls were found, they had to be burned. He sets up a pagan altar in the temple and sacrifices a pig to Zeus. The Jews are unhappy about this. This is ultimately what leads to the Maccabean revolt. They start to try and force Greek religion on the Jewish people at the edge of the sword. So the Maccabees say no. Mattathias is the name of the sort of patriarch of the family, and he says no. They kill the envoys of the king, and they run into the hill country. Eventually, to the great surprise of everyone, the Jews actually win. So the Jewish nation at this time isn't well organized. Israel has been ruled by a foreign power, and the Seleucids are much stronger. Their capital is in Damascus, in Syria, much further north. But they win. The Jews actually force the Greeks out of Palestine, and they are able to restore Jewish rule. But it's not to last. One of the problems at this time is that the priesthood becomes very, very political and politically motivated. So even like the high priest in the time of Jesus, that was very tied to politics. This is the rise of the group called the Sadducees. They come out of the Hasmoneans. We'll talk about Sadducees in a little bit as we get closer to the life of Jesus. It is unstable. And eventually, as you follow along in world history, as we get closer to the changing from BC to AD, the dawn of the first millennium, Rome is ascendant. Rome is conquering everything. So the Romans conquer first the Seleucids in Syria, and then they march south and they conquer Israel, and they conquer Egypt, and they conquer much of North Africa, and they go further east into the Fertile Crescent. Those all become Roman provinces. The Romans first off rule Judea through puppet kings. They set up a kind of relationship. So there's sort of a king, but he doesn't have the real authority. That lies with the Romans. And there's this kind of uneasy shared governance. Eventually, the province, the people resent Roman rule and paying taxes to pagan Romans, and the province is restive. It means there's a lot of rebellions, there's little things, soldiers get attacked, supplies get stolen, and so the Romans ultimately decide to take it up a level and institute a kind of military leadership. Pontius Pilate steps into this kind of role. He becomes the effective ruler of ancient Israel. And it's different than the puppet kings that were earlier. And you can feel this mess in the time of Jesus, where there's this relationship between Pilate and Herod kind of rules some things and not other ones, and there's definitely tension in the air. This happens, the people continue to rise up in revolt. Some Jews reject Roman rule under the force of arms. They want to eliminate them. In the modern world, we would call them terrorists. So they take up military training, they take up daggers, they stab the Romans when they appear at festivals. They're called the Sicarii. So there's a lot of tension. When the Jewish people are getting together, that's when these groups are taking advantage of it to attack the Romans, to steal supplies, to fight against garrisons. And so Rome grows increasingly distressed over this situation. It ultimately leads to Rome sending her army to crush the rebellion. As time goes on, from 70 BC until the life of Jesus, there's kind of an uneasy peace. After the life of Jesus, in the life of the early church, there is still an uneasy peace, but tensions are really growing. The Christians seem to stay out of it a little bit more. It's really the Jewish leadership who continues to antagonize the Romans, and they have fights with. This ultimately leads to a Roman invasion of the land with their army, with the Roman legions, and they get to a point where they are now going to intervene and put an end to this Jewish problem. And they do it by destroying the temple itself in 70 AD. They begin a campaign. They conquer Galilee in the north. They start marching south toward Jerusalem. Jerusalem holds out for a while, so the Romans host a giant siege of Jerusalem. They build a camp. They don't let anyone in or out. The people eventually are starving. Jews from the countryside had retreated into the city. It's very, very thick walls, very, very hard to take militarily. And it takes a long time. It takes them several years. And eventually the walls are breached. The Romans break into the city, and by that point they massacre everyone inside. Something in the neighborhood of 1 million people are killed. The streets run with blood. They murder everyone by that point. They have had it with these Jews that have engaged in a series of rebellions and attacks against Rome for some time, and they're going to deal with it as a kind of final way. And so they destroy it, and they erase it from the map. The Jewish leadership of the Sadducees is destroyed completely. The Pharisees retreat to a place on the Mediterranean coast called Jamnia or Yavne, and kind of try and regroup. Because a temple is destroyed, it's the end of the sacrificial system. This was prophesied by Jesus. He said this was going to happen. You have all of these things. He says to his disciples, like, there will come a day where there will not be one stone left on top of another. Today, the Temple Mount is barren. They've built on top of it the Dome of the Rock now, but everything was destroyed. The whole complex was gone. The Jews end up transitioning to Pharisaic leadership. They regather in Galilee, further north. Rome erases Jerusalem from the map. They rename it Aelia Capitolina, and they build the temple to Jupiter on the top of the Temple Mount. By this point, it's also important to remember that Alexandria is actually the largest Jewish expatriate community outside of Israel. The largest group of Jews in the world outside of Israel is in Alexandria. Many people seem to have fled there. Just to dive into some of the changes that happen after the exile. So this is diving back into that time after 586 BC as we move toward 0 and the birth of Jesus. As I mentioned earlier, synagogues are founded after the exile. So these can be anywhere. They can be outside of Jerusalem. They are not places of offering sacrifice, but they're places of study. They're places of prayer. They become a meeting place for the community. Rabbis are chosen. Rabbi is a word that means teacher. They contribute to the spreading of Scripture because they have to copy the text in order to provide it to the people. Each synagogue wanted copies. They also contribute to education. There's more rabbis around. After the time of the exile, you also start having the development of Jewish groups that are present by the time of Jesus. We don't know when all of these were founded. Some of them seem to have come out of that experience of exile. The first group is the Pharisees. I mentioned them earlier. They are a holiness movement. They want to have faithfulness to the law, and they apply a lot of the rules for the priests and the priesthood in the temple to the whole community of Israel. They're very concerned about cleanliness and uncleanliness because they consider it a part of a national desire. And the rejection of it as a national tragedy is what leads to exile. Their initial desire is probably mostly good. Jesus doesn't critique the Pharisees directly very often. He critiques their application of the law, them getting lost in the weeds, as it were, but their general theological principles Jesus seems to support. They believed in angels, they believed in messengers, they have prophecy, lots of those kind of things. Christianity preserves much of the sense of the holiness movement, that personal holiness is important, that faithfulness to the Word of God, to what He has revealed, is an essential part of life. But they do get stuck on their rules and their interpretations, and they definitely get stuck in the weeds. For the Pharisees, it's all about what you do, not so much what you believe. It's, do you wash your hands? Do you shake off the dust? Do you do this? Do you do that? Not as much in the heart. That's something that Jesus has a major problem with. In Christianity, you don't have either interior or exterior, you need both. So the Pharisees are very much associated with the synagogue system. They're the leaders of synagogues. They're widely thought of. They're well thought of. They're sort of the warriors, the Jewish warriors of the ancient world. Not warriors in the sense of battles and war and fighting, but warriors in the sense of striving to be faithful to what God has revealed. The Sadducees are sort of their corrupt counterparts. They're the modern day equivalent would be like the people of Washington, D.C. This group of people that maybe aren't quite the legislators themselves that are elected into Congress, but that sort of run things. So the Sadducees are that in the priesthood. The priests and the leadership of